Look, we live in an era of weaponized vocabulary. Words like authoritarian, fascist, socialist, and theocrat are just hurled across the political spectrum every single day. And a lot of times, they're used by people who are just trying to manipulate your emotions rather than actually describe reality. This deliberate blurring of meaning is in itself a really powerful tool of political control. So today, we're going to strip all that emotion away. In this explainer, we're diving deep into the objective blueprints and the literal, clinical mechanics of power. Because, let's be real, if you don't understand how power works, you're always going to be governed by the people who do. Okay, let's get into it.
Here is our agenda for today. 1. The language of power. 2. How democracies collapse. 3. The propaganda playbook. 4. The psychology of control. And 5. Signs of democratic backsliding. Think of this as an analytical, completely nonpartisan journey into political science.
Section 1. The language of power. To truly understand power, we've got to get our definition straight right out of the gate.
You know that traditional left-right political spectrum we always hear about? It's a massive simplification. Actually, it's practically a prison for our thinking. Instead, political scientists use a multi-axis map. We really need to look at the economic axis, like who controls the wealth, the political axis, how is power structured and constrained, and the social axis, how exactly does the state relate to identity and culture. Looking through this multi-axis lens is how we finally start seeing the true mechanics of governance.
So let's look at the clinical definition of authoritarianism. It's about strong central power, limited freedoms, and the active suppression of opposition. But here is the radical, entirely neutral truth about this term. It has absolutely no fixed economic ideology. Authoritarianism exists on the far left, like in Stalin's Soviet Union, and it exists on the far right, like in Pinochet's Chile. It's a method of wielding power, not a specific stance on capitalism or socialism.
Now, totalitarianism isn't just a fancy synonym for authoritarianism. It is an extreme escalation. The key word here is total. See, an authoritarian might just want you to obey the laws, pay your taxes, and keep your mouth shut. But a totalitarian state, it seeks to control everything. The art, the science, your family life, and literally even your thoughts. And to pull that off, it requires massive, sweeping surveillance and absolute ideological conformity. Another entirely distinct system is a theocracy. This can range from just having a mild influence to total clerical rule, but its absolute defining characteristic is the claim of a divine mandate. In a full theocracy, the whole idea of a separation of church and state is completely wiped out. Religious law literally becomes the governing law of the land. Section 2. How democracies collapse. Now that we have our vocabulary dialed in, let's ask a deeply unsettling historical question. How do ordinary, functioning democracies actually fall apart?
Well, this brings us to autocratization, which is honestly one of the most terrifying concepts in political science. Democracies rarely just die overnight in some violent military coup anymore. Instead, they erode from the inside. And the absolute key takeaway here is that the dismantling of a democracy often uses the system's very own tools, the legal system, the legislatures, the courts, to slowly choke out the opposition.
Just think about the most studied democratic collapse in human history, the Weimar Republic. From 1919 to 1933, they had free elections, a free press, an independent judiciary, the whole shebang. Then a crisis hits, the Reichstag fire in February 1933, and that was used to declare emergency powers. By March, the Enabling Act legally allowed rule by decree. By the end of it, censorship was the law, and opposition parties were outright banned. Hitler was legally appointed chancellor. The institutions of democracy were dismantled step by step, entirely within the legal framework of the state. Section 3. The propaganda playbook. To achieve that kind of internal collapse, a leader needs a very specific set of tools to manipulate public perception. There's this incredibly powerful quote from philosopher Eric Hoffer. He said, "Propaganda does not deceive people, it merely helps them deceive themselves." Propaganda isn't just about blatantly lying to people. It's about systematically exploiting our own internal psychology, our deep-seated fears and our anxieties.
Back in 1937, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis identified 7 universal techniques, and what is so fascinating about these is that they are used globally by literally all political factions to shape how we behave. We have name-calling to trigger a quick emotional response, glittering generalities, which use those noble-sounding but incredibly vague words, transfer to borrow the weight of sacred symbols, testimonials from authority figures, plain folks to build up a sort of false solidarity, card stacking to just cherry-pick the facts, and the bandwagon effect, which pressures us into conformity.
Let's actually deconstruct two of those specific tricks side by side. The straw man is when you misrepresent an opponent's position to make it ridiculously easy to attack. But the scapegoat? That is far more dangerous. This is the act of taking incredibly complex societal problems, things like economic anxiety or huge cultural shifts, and blaming them entirely on a minority or outsider group. Creating a concrete enemy creates intense group solidarity, and honestly, it brilliantly deflects attention away from any actual systemic failures.
Section 4. The psychology of control. So, why do these propaganda techniques work so incredibly well on everyday, intelligent citizens?
It really comes down to a mathematical equation for authoritarian control, one that's been used across centuries. It goes like this: fear, we are under attack, plus hate, here is exactly who is attacking us, plus hope, I alone can protect you. When a political actor manages to combine these three elements, it results in a massive unconditional loyalty transfer. Fear is the ultimate political fuel, for sure, because it actually completely bypasses the rational part of the human brain and goes straight to our primal threat response.
Hoffer noted something else incredibly profound about what he called the true believer. He wrote, "The less satisfaction we derive from being ourselves, the greater our desire to be like others. Mass movements appeal deeply to people who are experiencing frustrated desires. The movement steps in and provides meaning, a clear identity, and a designated enemy to explain all their frustration. And once a person is inside that coalition, their individual moral responsibility simply dissolves into the collective."
But psychology alone isn't going to cut it. You also need to control the environment itself. Modern authoritarianism systematically captures the information space in four very distinct ways. First, direct state ownership of media. Second, oligarchic capture, where wealthy allies just go out and buy up the media networks. Third, delegitimization, branding the free press as the enemy of the people or fake news. And finally, information flooding, producing so much contradictory content that everyday citizens just become exhausted and literally cannot figure out what is true anymore.
Section 5. Signs of democratic backsliding. This brings us to the ultimate stress test for any system.
If these mechanics of power are constantly at play, what are the actual real-world warning signs that the guardrails are failing? Well, political scientists Levitsky and Ziblatt identified four concrete indicators of democratic backsliding. 1. The rejection of democratic rules, like refusing to accept an election result. 2. The denial of opponents' legitimacy, treating rivals not as everyday political opponents but as existential traitors. 3. The toleration or outright encouragement of violence. And 4. A willingness to curtail civil liberties, like restricting press freedom. These four indicators give us a very clear, objective checklist to evaluate absolutely any political movement, no matter what side of the spectrum they're on.
And you know, this is exactly why the architecture of democratic republics, like the United States, for example, was built the way it was. The founders weren't naive. They studied their history. They deliberately designed a system to prevent tyranny. Separation of powers, federalism, the Bill of Rights, a constitutionally protected free press, an independent judiciary with lifetime appointments. These aren't just quaint little traditions. They are deliberate, structural mechanisms engineered to constrain power and slow down exactly the kind of consolidation we've just been talking about. So the crucial point we really need to take away is this. You can have the best structural architecture in the world, but it doesn't just run on autopilot. Democracy is not inherited. It is practiced or it is lost. The ultimate defense against these mechanics of power in the propaganda playbook isn't a law written on a piece of paper. It's a critical, media-literate citizenry that flat-out refuses to let their emotions be manipulated by fear.
I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to chew on, drawn from the educational simulation built around these exact concepts. I want you to honestly ask yourself, was there a moment when you failed to resist something you knew was wrong simply because it was easier not to? Because history shows us time and time again that it's in those moments of quiet convenience that the real mechanics of power actually take hold. Keep observing, keep questioning, and keep applying these tools to the world around you.